All right, so I see that people are in. I think we can more or less begin. All right, let me take this opportunity to welcome you all and to extend a very special welcome to our guest speaker, Elana Kaplan, who is a museum educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and at the Dörfner Judaica Museum. We're very excited to be able to join her in this virtual tour. Elana has created and leads an integrated learning and museum tour program for both adults and school groups at the Met Museum. She holds a BA in Jewish History from Barnard and a double master's from NYU in Jewish History and Museum Studies. She lives in Teaneck with her husband Jonathan and her 4 children. And of course, she is the daughter of our own Jackie and Alan Gerson. And we are excited about this opportunity. We are in for a treat. This is really an extraordinary way to re-engage in the world of museums and culture and community and all kinds of... I've said many times that despite the challenges of distance and disconnect that this pandemic has created, and Zoom has its own challenges, but the reality is it's also a little bit of a silver lining in that it's trained us all in a form of technology that allows us to take advantage of things that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do on a regular basis. And one of them is to be able to join Elana in a museum tour on a Sunday night from our living rooms or our studies. So it's really an honor and a privilege. I want to thank Beis Abe for their effort in helping and putting this together and co-sponsoring this evening's program. And I will turn it over to Elana and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Shulman. And thank you everyone for coming. Special thank you to all. I know there are a lot of sponsors. Special thank you to my parents who I know are sponsors. And really a special shout out to my mom who's really helped me find lots of venues to share my program with and help me go on kind of global. Also, thank you to Mrs. Shapiro, Phyllis Shapiro, for helping to organize this and really keeping in touch with me, and along with Kalanit and Monty, who all were very much in touch and very organized with the whole program. It's also very special for me to be presenting to my hometown of St. Louis that I have fond feelings and memories of growing up in St. Louis, and my family always loves to visit, and hopefully we'll be able to visit sometime very soon. I also wanted to just mention that it is today was the yahrzeit of my grandmother, Florence Paul, who many of you who are on tonight met and knew. And my grandmother was my Savta was a very intellectually curious woman, very well read, and she loved museums. So she would have loved this program, and it's very special. When we picked this date, I didn't realize it was going to be the night after a yahrzeit, but it's very special to me that it falls out this way. Okay. So what we're going to be doing tonight, just a quick overview so everyone knows our timing. My program lasts about an hour, and it will be a virtual tour of the ancient Egyptian galleries, some of the ancient Egyptian galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I will enhance that virtual tour with images and pictures and Tanakh sources. So just a little bit of background, the virtual tour that we're going to be seeing is, I'm using Google Street View of the Met. Now this was done in 2010. When it was done, it was the forefront of a technology. Now it's already 10 years old. So it's not as clear as other maybe virtual tours that you've seen, but I am going to enhance it with images so that everything will be very clear. We actually, when the museum was closed March 13th of 2020, we suggested to the museum that it would be a great time to have Google come back in and enhance the street view and bring it up to the cutting edge, but they weren't allowing anyone inside the museum at that time, besides essential people in the museum. So unfortunately they didn't do it, but It's not bad. We still have a good virtual tour. And again, I will enhance it with a lot of my own images. Okay, so I'm going to just start with sharing your screen. Okay. All right, so here we are. We're all at the Met together now, standing on the front steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm sure many of you have been there before. Just a little bit of a background of the ancient Egyptian wing of the museum. So there are about 30,000 objects in the ancient Egyptian collection. The majority of them are original artifacts, anywhere from 5,000 to 3,000 years old. Now, how did the Met get so many objects? We actually have one of the largest collections of ancient Egyptian objects outside of Egypt and London. How did we get that many objects? So it's actually a very interesting story going back to the early 1900s, where the Egyptian government welcomed archaeologists from all over the world to come to Egypt and go on archaeological digs. And there was a system in place back then that was called partage, which means to share. And the idea was the archaeologists from all over the world would come to Egypt. They would go on archaeological digs and they would share what they found with their museums, and half of it would go to their host museums and half of it would stay in Egypt. So it was looked at as beneficial for both the host museums and for Egypt because, of course, the host museums got all these amazing artifacts from ancient Egypt, and Egypt was able to use all of the expertise of archaeologists from around the world. So today, there are still archaeological digs going on. Even today, the Met and museums around the world do send archaeologists to Egypt, but they no longer have the system of partage. A lot of people feel like it was unfair. It was even maybe a system of colonialism. That's under debate. So today, when archaeologists go, they go for educational reasons and for research, but they no longer get to take half of what they find. But because of that system, it allowed museums around the world to really build up their collection of ancient Egyptian art. And we at the Met certainly benefited from that. We have, as I said, close to 30,000 objects from ancient Egypt. Okay, so we're going to get started looking at some of these objects together. So the first picture we're looking at is a picture that was taken in 1920 by a group of archaeologists from the Met who had set up an archaeological dig in Thebes in Egypt. And they came across an unbelievable find. They came across a tomb of a man named Mekhet-Re. Mekhet-Re was not a pharaoh, but he was an important official in ancient Egypt. He had been buried in 1986 BCE, so almost 4,000 years before this archaeological dig started exploring in the 1920s. Now, after he was buried, his grave was invaded by grave robbers, which was very common at that time because everyone was familiar with people being buried with many objects. So a lot of grave robbers would go in and take stuff. For some reason, they missed 2 rooms in this tomb. They robbed most of the tomb, but they missed 2 really important rooms. We don't know why. But the archaeologists came across these 2 rooms in 1920. So I'm going to show you a picture of what they saw when they first entered one of the rooms in Mekhet-Re's tomb. So this is, now remember, it's 1920, so it's a black and white photo and maybe not so clear, but hopefully you get a little bit of an idea of what they found in this tomb. They found a lot of models, wooden models. They found models of boats. They found models of, looked like boxes, lots of boats, people, animals that you guys might see here. Don't worry, I'm going to show you how it looks much clearer now in the museum, but I just wanted to give you a feel for what the archaeologists saw. This is a picture they took when they first entered the museum. Now, Mekhet-Re had been buried, as I said, in 1986 BCE, almost 4,000 years earlier, and these rooms had not been opened or touched in 4,000 years. So you might be wondering, why do things look a little bit broken or a little bit damaged? And that's, of course, because of the climate in Egypt. well, the climate actually allowed this stuff to, the wood to be preserved because of the dry heat, but also because that of the earthquakes and earth movement. So that's why you might notice that some things look a little bit jumbled or a little bit broken. No people had been in here, but because of the earthquakes and earth movements, their things were a little bit jumbled. Now, many people were buried in tombs, in pyramids. Pharaohs and important people were buried with a lot of stuff, but even average Egyptians were buried with things, more simple things, because they had a belief in the afterlife, and they believed that they needed these objects to live in the afterlife. So Mekhet-Re, these two rooms that we found of Mekhet-Re's tomb, he was buried with these models, these wooden models. So now I'm going to show you, this is a picture of what it looked like when the archaeologists entered, but now I want to show you what it looks like in the museum. So we are going to go to our virtual tour. Is everyone with me in the room of the museum? Thumbs up if everyone can see the room that we're in. Okay, so great. So this is one of my favorite rooms actually in the museum. So you might see blown up on the right, the picture we were just looking at of all the artifacts. And then in this room are those artifacts that were found in the room. Now remember, we have half of them. The other half are in the museum in Egypt. And actually these worked out pretty much very even, because if you'll see, I'll get a little closer over here. These are the boats. These are the models of the boats. So we have 6 of these boats, and the other 6 are in the museum in Egypt. And I will be showing you pictures of them so we can get a little closer up. I just want to give you a feel of what this room looks like. So these are the boats that were found in Mekhet-Re's tomb. They're all made out of painted wood. And there were also models of Mekhet-Re's estate, which are in these glass cases on the left. And here's the story that I was talking about, the ancient models from the tomb of Mekhet-Re, the picture I was just showing you. And this is what all the models look like in the museum. So this was really an unbelievable find that the archaeologists came across. These models had been prepared for Mekhet-Re's tomb, untouched for 4,000 years, and they really teach us about life in ancient Egypt. Okay, so one more look at these models, just to give you an idea of the size of them. The boats are about 50 inches in length. And they're all the original models. Okay, so now I want to get close up and have a chance to look at these models. Okay, so here's one of the boats that we were just looking at. Now you can see it a lot clearer. So boats were very important. Why was Mekhet-Re buried with so many boats? And by the way, King Tut in his tomb, he was also buried with models of boats. A lot of pharaohs and important people were buried with boats. Boats were very important in ancient Egypt because they were used for travel, for trade along the Nile River. It was also a symbol of the afterlife. Now, the Nile River is the longest river in the world. It was very important in ancient Egypt. And looking at these boats really shows us about boating in ancient Egypt. You can see a lot of people, there were a lot of slaves, a lot of workers. By the way, they're wearing what they were originally buried with, which is linen. Their clothing is made out of linen, which is interesting to think about the mitzvah of shatnez, right? About wool and linen. Linen was such an important material in ancient times. So they're all wearing linen bottoms. Mekhet-Re is in this boat. He's the one who's sitting under the awning. He's the only person who's not working. Everybody else has a job. This guy on the end of the boat is actually measuring the Nile River to see how, if it's too shallow or if it's going to overflow. Of course, the Egyptians believe that that was all the Nile River, and how high or how low it was controlled by the gods. And they believed that all of their nature was controlled by the gods. And of course, Mekhet-Re, being an important official, owned a lot of boats in his lifetime. He couldn't be buried with all of his boats. So instead, he was buried with models of his boats so that he would have them in the afterlife. Now, looking at this not only tells us how important the Nile River was and how important boating was, but really shows us what boats were like in ancient Egypt. It also informs us of how devastating the plague of blood was, right? So the plague of blood, which turned the Nile River and all water into blood. Of course, it was devastating because the drinking water, the Egyptians got their drinking water from the Nile River. They bathed in the Nile River. They used the water for agriculture, but they also used the Nile River for trade and travel, which was so important. And we can see how that's represented in these boats here. So really, it was really a devastating plague. By the way, the ancient Egyptians also believed that they would travel to the afterlife by boat. So that's why boats were also very important, and many important people had models of boats included in their tombs. So this is a traveling boat, one of Mequerre's, a model of Mequerre's traveling boat. He had many other boats, as we saw in the room in the Met. There were 6 different boats. So we'll look at another one. This is his fishing and fowling boat, which tells us, you know, how they fished in ancient Egypt. They did spear fishing. You can see the spears. Again, we have Mequerre who's sitting. He's the only person who's not working on the boat. We see they had different kinds of boats in ancient Egypt. By the way, the middle part with the white sticking up is where the sail would have been. And the large oar in the back would steer the boat. So again, it teaches us really the importance of boats and boating in ancient Egypt. And here we have another traveling boat. Again, Mequerre always sitting, the most important person. He's not working. We also get an idea of how many slaves there were in ancient Egypt. There was a big, anytime Egypt conquered another country, another land, they would often take people over as slaves. Now, these boats, as I said, were created around 1986 BCE. So that is before the Jews were in ancient Egypt. So these are not images of Jewish slaves, but it does give us an idea that there were many, many slaves in ancient Egypt. Okay, so the other thing that we had seen in the virtual tour, let's just go back for a minute. So we saw the boats, and then we were also looking at the models of Mequerre's estate. So these, in these glass cases over here, are 5 wooden models, and they show us, these are models, wooden models of Mequerre's estate where he lived, and they are unbelievable. They're an unbelievable record of ancient Egyptian life. And because we can't really see details of them in the virtual tour, you can maybe see a little bit. You can see some people in them, but I want to give you guys close-up details. So we're going to go back to our slides. And we're going to look at some of these models really close up. So here's our first model. So just take a minute to look at it and see if you can figure out. Now, again, these are models of Mequerre's estate, but they really teach us a lot about life in ancient Egypt. And I'm going to show you, this is just a bird's eye view of the same model we were just looking at. So looking at this model, you might recognize that this is a slaughterhouse. So this shows us what Mequerre's slaughterhouse looks like, but it also gives an idea of what slaughterhouses were like in ancient Egypt. You can see that they are slaughtering cows over here. It looks like there's some kind of duck also over here. They would hang the meat up to dry, which you can see on the top. They would collect the blood over here on the left. A couple of interesting things about this is, first of all, a lot of people think that they didn't eat meat in ancient Egypt, that they worshiped animals, but they didn't eat meat. So they did eat meat. They ate cows and other kind of meat. It was only the wealthy people ate meat because it was expensive. So of course, Mequerre would have meat to eat, but the average person would not have meat to eat. It also showed us how they slaughtered animals, drying out the meat. And it also sheds light on the idea of taskmasters, which we read about in Sefer Shemot, the idea of a taskmaster. You can see that there are slaves that are killing the animals and working with the animals, and then there's slaves that have their spears on other slaves, making sure that they're working. So this idea of taskmasters that we've read about in Sefer Shemot really is brought to life in this model here. So now here we have a quote from Shemot, which we actually just read this past Shabbat in Parshat Bashalach. And it says here, Vayomer aleim b'nei Yisrael mi yitain mutenu b'yad Hashem be'eretz Mitzrayim b'shivtenu al sir habasar ba'achlenu lechem l'sova. Okay, so these words al sir habasar, which is translated here as flesh plots, but it really has the word basar, meat. So the idea that the Jews are saying, you know, why'd you take us out of Egypt where we had meat? We sat by the flesh pots, we ate meat and we ate bread. Okay, so we see here from this quote and from the Meket Ray models that they did eat meat, that people did eat meat in ancient Egypt. And meat for the upper class, but bread was a main staple, right? Lechem l'sava, bread was very important for everyone in ancient Egypt. That was a main staple of the diet. And we're going to see this through the models. So this is actually my favorite model in the entire Meket Ray room. And if you take a minute to look at it, you might be able to figure out what's going on in this model. This is actually a model of Meket Ray's granary. So this is so important to help us visualize the whole idea of the whole story of Yosef in Mitzrayim, right? So let's first look at this model, Meket Ray's model, and then we can imagine it on a larger scale. So here we have a granary. We have in the corner over here, we have our scribes who are recording how much grain comes in and how much grain goes out. So then we have people bringing the grain in, they have them at sacks in their back, and they're pouring these sacks of grain into these pits. Now you might see inside the pit are little, looks like pieces of grain, and actually in Meket Ray's tomb, there was grain, and we know that it was actual grain because when the archaeologists opened the tomb and found this model, there were little rat droppings in these areas, and they realized that rats had been in there and eaten up a lot of the grain. But this is a great visualization of Meket Ray's granary. And of course, Yosef was in charge of the granary for Paro, for all of Egypt. So it would have been a much larger granary, but the idea of keeping track of grain, the idea of the importance of grain in ancient Egypt, grain was not just used for food, it was actually a commodity. Remember when Yosef's brothers came to Mitzrayim and they wanted to buy grain because of the famine. So it was really very, very important in ancient Egypt. And this model really helps us visualize this idea of a granary. So here we have the next model. So what did they use the grain for? Why was grain so important in ancient Egypt? So you might be able to tell what they're making on the two different sides here. On the right side, they're using the grain and making it into bread, which we said was a staple in ancient Egypt. And on the left side, you might see these little jars over here. That is, they would put grain in a jar with water from the Nile River. They would ferment that grain and they would get beer. Now, beer wasn't seen as an alcoholic drink. It was really a regular drink in ancient Egypt. They could use their Nile River water and grain and, you know, get this drink that made the Nile River water maybe taste a little bit better. I think I have this is just a bird's eye view of the same model, just seeing how they're making bread and how they're making a beer on the other side. So again, the importance of grain, it was really a staple of the Egyptian diet. And you know, the Bnei Yisrael referred to that in our last source in Beshalach, how important, you know, they had their fill of bread, which meant, you know, they had enough to eat. And we can also use this to relate to other sources from Breshit. So our first one talks about Paro, and he was angry at his two main chiefs, his chief cupbearer, or the chief winemaker and the chief baker. So a baker was so important in ancient Egypt because bread was such an important staple of the diet. And then we have in our next source from Breshit, about Yosef's job, right? And his job was to gather all the grain for 7 years, and he stored the grain in cities, and he put grain in each city with the fields around it. So this is telling us about Yosef's job being in charge of Paro's granary and, you know, the grains in different cities. So those granaries would have been much bigger. But looking at Meket Ray's granary, it really brings this idea to life. It really allows us to visualize what did a granary look like in ancient Egypt? Why was it so important? Why was grain so important? So these the models really bring these Tanakh sources to life. Okay, and our last model that we're looking at is Meket Ray's garden. And again, all these models were made out of wood. They're made out of painted wood. And we're just going to go back and look at that picture. It's it's a slightly different picture, but a similar picture to the one that we started with. So now that we've seen the objects in the museum and we've seen pictures of the objects, you can really see clearly what the archaeologists found when they first opened this tomb after 4,000 years and how it was such an exciting discovery. Again, here up in the right corner, you can see that garden we were just looking at. You can see some of the boats, some of the models. Now you might be thinking, wait, we didn't see all these things that we're looking at, but remember, half of it is in the museum in Cairo. I actually have a colleague who went a couple of years ago, and she said they have a room in the museum in Cairo that looks exactly like our room in the Met. They just have the other, half of the objects in that museum. Okay, so we're going to move on now to another topic and another area of the museum. A question that I get very often is, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? People ask me that all the time. I actually just wrote an article for our local newspaper discussing this whole topic, because it's one that comes up especially now during Sefer Shemot and these parshiot. So we have a source here from Malachim Aleph, which tells us that in the 480th year after the Jews left the lands of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, which is Iyar, the second month, Shlomo began to build the Beit HaMikdash. So we know that the Beit HaMikdash was built around 966 BCE. So if that was 480 years after Yetziat Mitzrayim, so that would put Yetziat Mitzrayim around 1446 BCE. Now, these are all roundabout dates, and also trying to take Tanakh dates and match them up with ancient archaeological dates is always very tricky, which is why there are many different opinions about who the pharaoh of the Exodus is. But if we use this source for our first explanation, that would say that the pharaoh in 1446, which is the year that the Exodus would be based on this source, the name of the pharaoh would have been Thutmoses III. Okay, he was the pharaoh in Egypt. He actually ruled for many years, but he was a pharaoh in 1446. Okay, so if we say that Thutmoses III was the pharaoh of the Exodus, the pharaoh of the oppression was actually a different pharaoh, because we'll see in a later source, here we'll go forward for a minute, that it says, Vayihi b'yamim harabim vayamat melech Mitzrayim. So the king of Mitzrayim died, and that presumably was a king of the oppression, and a new king, and that was a king of Exodus. So if Thutmoses III was a king of the Exodus, the pharaoh of the Exodus, then the pharaoh before him was the pharaoh called the pharaoh of oppression. So who was the pharaoh before him? It's actually a very interesting story. I'm going to go back and tell you through pictures. So the pharaoh before Thutmoses III was a female pharaoh whose name was Hatshepsut. So any of you are familiar with her, she's a very fascinating woman. She was not supposed to be a pharaoh. She actually was the stepmother and also aunt of Thutmoses III. And when her husband died, Thutmoses III was only 2 years old. So Hatshepsut decided, he's too young to be pharaoh. I'm going to make myself pharaoh until he's old enough to rule. So she was not supposed to be pharaoh. She made herself pharaoh in the year around 1479 BCE. And because she wasn't supposed to be pharaoh, she had to really make it legitimate that she was pharaoh. So this is actually a sphinx of Hatshepsut. And you'll notice that in most of her sculptures, she is presented as a male pharaoh. She has the false beard and the headdress that is typical of the pharaohs. And she's really presented as a male because she wanted to be taken seriously because she wasn't supposed to be pharaoh. So in most of her sculptures, she is presented as a male. Now, the reason I know that this is the Sphinx of Hatshepsut is because there are hieroglyphics right over here, because actually there are no personalized features on her to tell us that who she is, but all of these sculptures have hieroglyphics on them that tell us who the people in the sculptures are, because they all pretty much look the same. So just to give you an idea of the size of this is a picture of me in the museum recently next to the Sphinx of Hatshepsut. Now I just want to show you what some of the sculptures of Hatshepsut look like in the museum, just to give you an idea. So we're going to go back into the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is a room filled with sculptures of Hatshepsut. Now remember, she wasn't supposed to be pharaoh. She made herself pharaoh. She presents herself in sculptures as a male so that she'll be taken seriously. And these sculptures are really very huge. I'm not sure if you can get an idea. Unfortunately, there aren't any people in these pictures, so it might be hard to get an idea of the size of them. But if you see the labels on the wall, and labels are usually about eye view, you can see that these are really very large sculptures carved out of stone. When I lecture in front of these, if I'm standing in between, I reach up till about her arms. And these are sculptures of Hatshepsut giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. You'll notice in all of them that she has a false beard and she has a headdress. She really is portrayed as a male. These are carved out of solid stone, granite, some of them marble. It's really an unbelievable feat in ancient Egypt, 4,000 years ago, that they were able to use a hammer and chisel and carve these unbelievable sculptures out of stone. So this is a room full of sculptures of Hatshepsut. Now, why is this so important for our story? So I just want to give you an idea of these sculptures. There are many sculptures made of Hatshepsut. By the way, you might notice that in a lot of the sculptures, her face is broken. Parts of her face, especially her nose or other parts of her face, are broken. And that actually was done on purpose by Thutmose III. When after Hatshepsut died and he became king, he was very angry that she had, ruled instead of him. And he had a lot of her sculptures destroyed or at least defaced, because they believed in ancient Egypt that if you deface someone's sculpture or someone's painting, that you've actually, almost destroyed them. If you destroy an image of them, you've destroyed the person. So Thutmose III actually had many of Hatshepsut's sculptures broken, the face defaced. He actually also erased her from a list of pharaohs. And it was, we actually didn't know until the 1800s that there was a pharaoh named Hatshepsut, because a lot of the information had been destroyed by Thutmose. Okay, so we're going to go back and look at these a little bit closer and a little bit clearer. This is just another sculpture of Hatshepsut, again, presenting herself as a strong male pharaoh. Okay, so now there are a couple of sculptures of Hatshepsut where she does look more feminine. Like in this one, you can see she's wearing a skirt. She's got a necklace on. It's carved out of marble. She doesn't have the false beard. So there are some sculptures of her where she looks more feminine. And we have the hieroglyphics that tell her it's Hatshepsut. But in general, she really was portrayed as a male. So now we're going to go back to our sources, and it's very interesting to think of the fact that perhaps Hatshepsut was the pharaoh of oppression. It works out with the timing. She was pharaoh from 1479 to 1458 BCE. So if we say that according to our timeline that the Exodus was in 1446, it would fall out that Hatshepsut was the pharaoh of oppression, and her stepson, who was also her nephew, was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So now let's look at it through the sources. And this is an interesting way to look at it. And I just wrote an article about this. So it says in the first paragraph of Shemot, it says, Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef. So a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. So traditionally we say either it was a new king or it was the same king, but he pretended not to know Yosef. So there are some interpretations that say that this was a new king arose, which means the king arose as a usurper. They were not supposed to be the king. And that would certainly fit in with Hatshepsut. She wasn't supposed to be the pharaoh. She made herself pharaoh. So that would fit into that explanation. The other interesting thing to think about, if it was a female pharaoh, when we look at our next source, when it's talking about the pharaoh commanding the midwives to kill the boy babies, and it says, Vayomer beyaledchen et ha'ivriot u'reitan al ha'avnayim. Okay, so she's saying when you deliver the women, the Jewish women, look at the birth stool. So this word avnayim, it's a birth stool. It's a very specific way to talk about the birthing process. And who would be so familiar with that if it weren't a female pharaoh, right? Hatshepsut herself actually, even though Tutmosis III was her stepson, she herself did have at least one daughter. She gave birth herself and would be very familiar with this process. So that is an interesting way to look at this. Also, the other thing is, if you think about it, the midwives, we never learned that they got punished or they got in trouble for not following Paro's decree that they kill the boy children. So if you think about it though, if it was a time where Hatshepsut had taken power and she was a usurper and she wasn't supposed to have power, that would mean that the government in Egypt was a little bit in an upheaval. People were maybe upset that Hatshepsut had taken this power. And so they didn't care if the pharaoh's decrees were not being followed. They weren't going to punish anyone who wasn't following those decrees. So these are three different ways to look at the sources and explain them in a way that perhaps Hatshepsut was the pharaoh of the oppression. Okay, now moving on, there are other opinions, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the opinion that Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. The dates are a little bit difficult because for many reasons. First of all, most people say it was Ramses II, which, by the way, I'm just will explain this picture I have here, and my parents will get a big kick out of this picture because it's a picture taken when I was in Egypt. I went to Egypt, the year I spent in Israel, I went to Egypt, and my parents have lots of interesting stories about my getting permission to do that. But anyway, I did go to Egypt many years ago. So this is a picture of me next to a sculpture of Ramses II, who many people believe was a pharaoh of the Exodus. And this is a picture of my friend lying down next to the sculpture. And these are just to give you an idea of these huge sculptures in ancient Egypt. They're unbelievably huge and really give you this feeling that the pharaohs thought that they were gods and they were so important that they made these grandiose sculptures of themselves. So a lot of people believe that the pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramses II. Because of the sources that we have here next. In Shemot, we have a source that says that that the slaves built these Arei Misknot for Paro at Pitom and at Ramses. So if they built these cities, one of them was called Ramses, so it must be that Ramses was the pharaoh at the time. So there are a lot of problems with that explanation. First of all, the timing is difficult because Ramses II, presumably the Ramses this people are saying is a pharaoh, he ruled a long time. Ramses II actually was the longest ruling pharaoh in ancient Egypt. He ruled for about 67 years. He lived to be over 90, which at that time, the average lifespan was 30 years, was unbelievable. Ramses II was a very strong pharaoh. He conquered many nations, and many believe that he was the pharaoh of the Exodus. But he was pharaoh around 1250 BCE. So that would make it difficult to place the Exodus at that time, according to the source that we were looking at in Malachim. The other part that makes it difficult is, although this city was named after Ramses, there were 11 pharaohs named Ramses. There was Ramses 1 through 11. Ramses II was just the strongest of all of them, but there were 11 pharaohs named Ramses. There was a pharaoh named Ramses that ruled Egypt for 230 years because there were 11 Ramses that ruled over a span of 230 years. The fact that the city was named Ramses does not mean that Ramses II was pharaoh at that time. In addition, if we look at this source from Breshit, when Yosef settled his family in Goshen, it talks about it being in the region of Ramses. So this is way before Ramses II was pharaoh. So it seems to be that the city was named Ramses, having nothing to do with the pharaoh named Ramses. But there are people who do believe that Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Another opinion that I did want to present. Okay, so I just wanted to go back for 1 minute to the picture of my trip to Egypt. And a lot of people said to me at the time, how are you able to go to Egypt? Jews are not allowed to travel to Egypt. So I felt like before I went there, I should do some research and look into this. And I found different sources, but here we have a source from Rambam, which talks about It's really permissible to live anywhere in the world except for Egypt. So it's really a problem to live in Egypt. But it is permissible to return to Egypt to conduct business or commerce or to conquer lands. The only problem, the only prohibition is really against residing permanently there. So some of you might be questioning because the Rambam himself lived in Egypt for many years. And there are sources that that show us that the Rambam himself felt badly about it and felt that maybe he was transgressing this. But there are many different ways to work around this, including that perhaps it was only a prohibition during the time of the Torah. Perhaps it was only if you went to Egypt a certain way, or if you really planned to live there forever, but not if you went there just to reside for a couple of years because of oppression or other reasons. So there are many reasons, there are many ways to get around that, but certainly it is not a problem to visit Egypt. And in fact, I'm in touch with a lot of rabbis and archaeologists in Israel who have gone to Egypt many times. Okay, so we're going to move on now to another type of art that we have in the museum, which are facsimile paintings. So before we look at some details, I just want to bring us back into the museum. And I think I keep saying this, but this is one of my favorite hallways in the museum. I happen to, like many, this is one of my favorite collections, the ancient Egyptian collection in the Met. So I have many favorite areas. So we are now in the hallway in the Met. So those of you who have been here before might recognize this hallway. It's right outside of the Grace Rainey Rogers Auditorium, which there are a lot of lectures and concerts that go on there. And this is a room full of what we call facsimile paintings. Now, I had said at the beginning that all the objects in the museum, or most of them, are real. They're anywhere from 5,000 to 3,000 years old, except for these paintings. These paintings were originally paintings that were done on tombs. As I had said, that the tombs were painted and filled with objects so that when the Egyptians came back to life in the afterlife, they would have their objects with them, and the paintings also would kind of come to life and bring them back to the lives that they lived. So now the museum couldn't bring all these tomb paintings because they were painted on tomb walls. So instead, they did the next best thing. With the archaeologists, they sent artists that would sit in these tombs in the 1920s, and they copied these paintings exactly. And it's unbelievable what they did, because they were sitting in very dark, warm, dark tombs. They couldn't use bright light because they didn't want to affect the paint colors. And they were copying the paintings exactly the way they were seeing them. So why are these paintings so unbelievable? Because they really show us about life in ancient Egypt. They show us about animals. And I will show you close-ups of these paintings, but they show us about different animals. They show us about they show us about how they, what the kind of clothing that they wore, the boats that they had, how they worked the land, different things about pharaohs, about fashion, about the role of women. So these paintings are so important. And our paintings in the museum are actually in much better condition than the paintings that are in Egypt, because those have been exposed to the elements for all these years. So as we get a little bit closer, you can see, we see the way people are dressed in ancient Egypt. We see the way they painted in ancient Egypt. I think that's why everyone has this, they say walk like an Egyptian, and they put their hands a certain way because they painted Egyptians in profile, right? You only see one eye in all the people. They're painted in profile, very different than the sculptures that we saw, which are full frontal views. So we see how they, how they painted in Egypt, how they, what they did agriculturally, the importance of pharaohs and upper class people versus slaves, which are painted much smaller. The pharaohs are always bigger, the slaves are always smaller. And we learn about the tools in ancient Egypt. We see paintings that have chariots in them. And it's really unbelievable. They're really very detailed. This is a painting of a pharaoh and his wife. The wife was always behind because the pharaoh was seen as more important. So lots and lots of details that we have here. And I just want to show you a couple of close-ups of these paintings because they're a little hard to see close up. So this is actually a painting from the tomb of Ramses that we were just talking about. And it's a painting of his funeral procession, people carrying things to his funeral. We can't see all of the things they're carrying, but they're carrying furniture and they're carrying sandals and jars and jugs and all kinds of things. And the hieroglyphics tell us exactly what's going on here. So very detailed. This next painting is actually one of my favorite paintings. It's a painting of a artisan's workshop, showing us different artists and artisans preparing objects for a pharaoh's tomb. So first of all, it tells us that the tombs were prepared for the pharaohs or for people's entire lives because so much went into them. And if you look closely, you'll see people making jewelry. You will see them making furniture. You will see this guy on top here weighing gold. So this also tells us about weights and measurements in ancient Egypt. You'll notice that the important person, whose tomb is being prepared right now, he's double the size of the slave to show how important he is. You'll also notice that his face is etched out, which was done on purpose. Somebody didn't like him. And the same thing with our sculptures of Hatshepsut that were defaced. So this man's face was defaced also. Let's look at a close-up of this. So here's a close-up of the same facsimile painting we were looking at, just so you can see the weights and measures a little close up, the jewelry they're making. And my favorite part of the close-up, this man who's making a sphinx, a smaller sphinx. You can see the simple tools they're using, a hammer and a chisel, very simple tools. So again, these paintings really bring to life ancient Egypt and allow us to imagine what the Jewish experience, the Jews' experience in Egypt was. And also that there were so many slaves and so many people working constantly in ancient Egypt. And really gives us a feeling of that from these paintings. And again, this one we actually saw on the wall in the virtual tour, but also an idea of the animals that they had, agricultural tools that they had, and all of those details. Okay, so now we're going to get to our last topic that we're going to talk about before I open up for any questions or comments. And this is a room for anyone who's been to the Met. You might have been in this room before. It's a very well-known room. It's a room that has a temple in it. We can see the temple back here. This is actually a picture of the room, but I will take you on I'll take you into the museum to this room. So this is a room, it's called the Temple of Dentor. This building that you're looking at in the back is an actual ancient Egyptian temple. And the room was created to make you feel like you are in ancient Egypt. Actually, all the way in the back here on the left, very small, is the Sphinx of Hatshepsut that we saw more towards the beginning of our talk. So I'm going to just take us back into the museum. Okay, so here we are in the museum, and the room was created for the Temple of Dentor to make us feel like we're in Egypt. So you can see our Nile River over here. The windows are curved, they're slanted to look like pyramids. We have sculptures of many pharaohs. These are two sculptures of pharaohs, and then we also have sculptures of a number of goddesses on the wall over here. Just going through the room a little bit. So hopefully you get a little bit of a feeling as if you're in this room. We have pictures on the left of the Temple of Dentor when it was in Egypt, and I will show you these pictures clearer, but it tells a story of the Temple of Dentor, which originally was in Egypt on the banks of the Nile River and is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we'll look at those. Here, if we get a little closer, we can see that Sphinx of Hatshepsut that I had showed you before. So the room really, you feel like you're in ancient Egypt. This is the Temple of Dentor. You are allowed to go into the first room of it. And on the side, it has a lot of carvings of pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. Now, this is one temple. It was a temple to a goddess named Isis. There were many temples that were built on the banks of the Nile River. And this will gives us an idea of why when Moshe approached Pharaoh and he said, we have to leave Egypt in order to worship, there were so many temples in Egypt and so many sculptures of gods and goddesses and so much worshiping going on. There was really a lot of, idol worship that it wouldn't, that Moshe really wanted to bring the Jews out of Egypt in order to in order to serve Hashem, because it wouldn't be appropriate with all of these temples and gods and goddesses around and all these images. Okay, so here's what the Temple of Dendor looks like. Many of you might have been in this room in the museum. If you haven't been there, and once things open up again, it is an unbelievable room to visit. The windows look out onto Central Park, and it's really a huge, unbelievable temple. So how did we get it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art? So let's look at that through the pictures, which the pictures that you see on the wall over here, I am going to just show you them closer so we can really see the story through pictures. Okay, so here's what the Temple of Dendor looked like when it was in Egypt. This is a picture from the mid-1800s, actually. The Temple of Dendor is in Egypt, near the Nile River, but you can't really see the Nile River in this picture. That will change as we go on. Here we have the Temple of Dendor again. And the side of the temple that we were just looking at together with images carved of the gods and goddesses. Now we see the same Temple of Dendor, but the Nile River has overflown. So it's starting to get a little higher. And it's starting to wash up a little bit on these various temples that were located near the Nile River. Now you see our same Temple of Dendor, which is completely underwater. So basically what happened was when Egypt built the Aswan Dam, it led to a lot of flooding, and it led to a lot of these national treasures being flooded. So in the 1960s, the Egyptian government appealed to the government in the United States and asked for help to control the Nile River water so it wouldn't destroy all these national treasures. The American government sent over engineers and all their different expertise to help the Egyptians. And as a thank you, Egypt said, we want to give you one of our temples. As a thank you, we're going to give you the Temple of Dendor. So of course, every museum in the United States would want the Temple of Dendor, especially the Smithsonian's. So there was some kind of contest which various museums entered, and they gave an idea of what they would do if they won the Temple of Dendor. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art said that they would create an entire wing in the museum where you felt like you were in Egypt to house the Temple of Dendor. So the Met won this contest. And now we will see how it was brought there. I mean, this is a temple made out of stones that weigh a ton. And so it had to be taken apart brick by brick. They were brought over, crated and brought over by boat to huge barge boats to New York, to the harbor, and then they were brought over. The Met built this room onto the museum, overlooking Central Park. So here's the story in pictures. By the way, a lot of those pictures were in the museum on the side. They were just hard to see. Here's what it looks like as it's being built up. And here's what the room looks like today. And you can see if you get really close up, it has unbelievable carvings and hieroglyphics with the gods giving, pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. Again, these gods and goddesses, images of them are carved onto the temples, which is one reason that Moshe did not want to be around this area. You might also notice there's some color left. This is the side of the Temple of Dendor. Even though it looks great in stone, it actually would have originally been painted red, yellow, green, and blue. You can still see some of the color on top. Most of it, unfortunately, got washed away when the Nile River would overflow. And we can see all the hieroglyphics, which tell us all the information that I'm explaining to you about the gods and goddesses, that it's a temple to the goddess Isis. This is a picture of myself recently in the museum. The museum started using like a laser technology to light up the Temple of Dendor to show us what it would have looked like when it was originally painted. So that's something that they've started to doing to, again, allow us to visualize what it would have looked like in ancient times. And you might have noticed at the beginning that there was some graffiti or some carvings on it. This happened when the Temple of Dendor was in Egypt. Unfortunately, people used to visit and carve their name on it. So we have from a long time ago, this is from 1818, but when people used to visit in Egypt, they would carve their name. Unfortunately, we can't get rid of this, but again, it's the details on the Temple of Dendor are really unbelievable. And again, explains so much about what life was like in ancient Egypt and really bring the whole story, the Israelite experience in ancient Egypt. All these artifacts really bring it to light. So I'm going to end my presentation here, but I do want to leave time for anyone who has questions or comments. If anyone wants to unmute with any questions or comments, I would be happy to answer as best as I can.
Can I jump in first?
Definitely.
I'd love to go back to your calculations on the pharaohs for a minute, and just ask you the question: if you calculate from the other direction, meaning not from the building of the temple backwards, but from the calculation forward in Breshit and Shmo, uh, most calculations in the Medrash put the birth of Abraham at 1948, 400 years later the birth of Isaac, 2048, and then 400 years later the Exodus of 2448. That would put us at 1312 BCE. Is there any pharaoh in that realm, that region of time, that might also be a candidate to this discussion?
So it is, so according to that calculation, there are some people who actually use that to say that Ramses II could be the pharaoh. You have to fudge the dates a little bit because he was pharaoh, again, he was pharaoh for 67 years. So it was a long time. There's a little differential on the dates, but some date him around 1290, 1280, 1290. So it could stretch to that time. So there are people who use that to back up that Ramses II could have been the pharaoh at that time. And then you can also use the idea of Pitom and Ramses and that city if you use that calculation.
Thank you.
Okay, I see that there are some questions. You know what? I think I'm going to stop my screen share so I can see. Oh, okay. Great. Okay, so question here, what are the ethics regarding taking items from a tomb? Okay, so that's a great question and a great conversation. I actually like to have that conversation a lot when I work with school groups and talk about the idea of taking items from a tomb. Remember, the Egyptians were buried with all these items because they believed in an afterlife and they would need these objects when they came back to life. So now a lot of the objects were taken from tombs by grave robbers, which was done soon after people were buried. But then a lot of them were taken by archaeologists. Of course, the famous archaeologist Howard Carter of London, who gave many of the objects to the British Museum. So it's a conversation. I mean, there are many people who believe it's really a problem and it was wrong. And there are other people who say if they hadn't done that, then we would never have learned about life in ancient Egypt. And for the Egyptians and for Egyptian history, for museums all over the world to have objects from there. That was, the only way to do that was to take them out of the tombs because the majority of all these objects were found in tombs. If you relate it even to objects that we have, from Israel, right, in museums all over the world, if we didn't have those objects, how would people be able to learn about the culture? How would be able to learn about that history without going to the country? So it is definitely an ethical question that we talk about a lot. But it was all done with the agreement and the encouragement of the Egyptian government in the early 1900s. Okay, let's see. Okay, someone asked, the oppression was, yes, the oppression was longer than 30 years. Yes, definitely. There are different opinions. Well, the Jews were in Egypt for 210 years, but they weren't slaves the whole time. There are differences of opinion. I think it could be anywhere that they were slaves anywhere from 116 years to 86 years, depending on how you date it. So that it was a much longer time, either anywhere from 86 years to 116 years that the Jews were slaves in ancient Egypt. Yes. Okay. Let's see. There's a long comment here. Oh, thank you. Okay, great. Yes, there's some interesting. Okay, so yes, the Temple of Dendor is later than the Temple of Dendor is actually from the 1st century. So it's only about 2,000 years old, as opposed to a lot of the objects in the museum, which are 4,000 to 5,000 years old. Things did change very slowly in terms of in terms of artistic, like if you look at the objects from ancient Egypt, the way they carved, the way they painted, the way they made sculptures was pretty much the same over a span of 3,000 years, which is interesting. If you think about today, you have art movements that change all the time, right? You had, if you look at Impressionism and post-impressionism and modern art and everything, how quickly art changes. But in Egypt for 3,000 years, they really, the way they carved, the way they built, the way they made things really was the same. So that would have been a similar type of temple to earlier temples. Someone made reference to the museum in Cairo. Yes, there's actually, they're in the middle of building a new museum in Egypt. It's called GEM, the Grand Egyptian Museum. They started building it in 2012. It was supposed to be finished this year. Because of COVID, it's been pushed off. It's supposed to open sometime this year. So it's been 10 years in the making. There will be 100,000 ancient Egyptian artifacts in that museum. You can see some of it online. It's unbelievable. They have most of the objects from King Tut's tomb, his chariots and his jewelry and his gold and his models of boats, also similar to what we saw. But yeah, that is going to be unbelievable when it opens. The British Museum also has unbelievable collection, larger than the Met. They have an unbelievable collection of ancient Egyptian art also. Okay, great. Yes, I think those are all the comments in the chat. If anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment, now is definitely the time. Oh, now I can actually see everyone. So it's so nice to see. I couldn't see most people during my presentation. So I see my parents, shout out, and lots of familiar faces. This is so nice to see so many familiar faces on the screen.
Elana, you're amazing. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Ditto. Thank you.
Double ditto.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to just take this moment to thank Elana for this really enlightening presentation. I learned a lot. I got so excited I changed my virtual background to the temple. But this was I learned a lot. I've been in that room a dozen times, and I learned a lot more than I ever did just walking through there. So I appreciated this, and I want to thank everyone at Young Israel for working with Beisabe and making this happen, and especially to Kalanit and Phyllis, Kalanit Chapel and Phyllis Shapiro and Monty Mazer, who I know worked really hard on all the logistics of this, setting this up. And it's really nice to be able to get together with our two communities and make something happen. So thank you, Elana, for being the catalyst for this.
Thank you. So thank you everyone so much for coming. It was really nice to see everyone, and thanks for all the comments. I'm reading all the comments in the chat. I really appreciate all the comments. And if anyone has any further questions, I'm gonna put my email in the chat. If anyone has any further questions or comments, or is learning something or reading something and wanna run it by me, please feel free to do that. I put my email in the chat. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Elana, can I ask one last question?
Yes, definitely.
So in 1980, I was in Egypt, and I went to the Cairo Museum and spent a day. It reminded me of like going into someone's attic. And it wasn't very well organized back then, and it had cobwebs, but I assume you've gone through that museum when you were on your visit.
Yes.
And how does that compare? I don't know what era you went, but how did that compare to what you see at the Met, or the way the Met currently treats the that historical subject?
Yes. So I was there. I think I was there in '91. And I do remember it being like a little bit all over the place. So the Met is definitely more organized, I would say. I haven't been to the Cairo Museum though so that was a long time ago, 30 years. So I don't know what it's like now, but I can tell you this new museum that they're building is going to be state of the art. You can actually, if you Google it and go online, it's unbelievable. It's really state of the art, and it will have the most up to date in terms of museology and how to show things and how to date things. So that will definitely be the museum to go to. I don't know the museum in Cairo. I don't know what it's been like, for the past 30 years. I'm assuming they did update things. And I know a friend of mine actually went not maybe 10 years ago, and she said, when we compared notes, that it was more similar to the Met at that point in terms of the layout of how they were doing things.
Right.
Elana, how about when life returns to whatever normal will be, we make a date and you take a bunch of us to the museum, to your favorite places there.
I would love it. That would be great. And that would be great. I don't know if I have bumped into a few people from St. Louis at the Met, which is bumping into someone who's pretty unbelievable because it's a huge museum with about 2 million objects and 4 city blocks long. But I bumped into Shell Meadow there one time, and I have bumped into other people. But I would love, when everything opens and it's safe to travel, to bring any of you on a tour of the museum.
Okay.
Elana,
The museum is open now, by the way, with very strict rules. As you saw me with my mask on in those pictures. It is open because it's such a huge place. You can go there and not be anywhere near another person. So it is in there with it's open right now with very strict, rules in place.
Adina, I thought you were going to suggest that she take us on a tour of Egypt on a date.
Well, I didn't want to go that far, but if you want to go to Egypt,
yeah.
I'd love to go to Egypt.
I do have a serious question. The difference between the both segments we saw in the photograph, the black and white photo, and then the final product makes me ask, how much is a reconstruction, a replica? It didn't look authentic.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So as you saw, they were a little bit broken and mixed up a bit. So the museum actually, and this goes back to the question I was asked before, museums have changed a little bit in terms of kind of fixing things up. It used to be that they would try and make things look more like the originals. And they did with some of the Hatshepsut sculptures, you might have noticed also that they did add a little bit to, or fix them up a little bit. So that was in the early 1900s, that was what they were doing. In the early 1900s, the mid 1900s. Now they don't do that anymore. But with a lot of those Mecha models, they did have to fix things up. They didn't change them or add anything onto them, but they might have had to fix them. And it was all based on things that they read and pictures that they saw. They weren't, making anything up or doing anything that wasn't based on research. But they did have to put them back together a little bit, and they tried to stay as true to the original as possible. But today, if they would find something that's broken, they would really leave it like that. They wouldn't, add on to it or try and fix it at all. So that's changed a little bit in terms of how the museum does things. Any other questions?
Yes. Are there any of like Pharaoh's chariot wheels that could be dated that possibly could, we've heard that there's some that have been like underwater near the crossing of the Red Sea, and there's a different number of spokes or some differences depending on, the centuries they were made that could date something about the Exodus.
So, it's an interesting question. There's really no archaeological evidence of the Exodus from Egypt. And there are different ideas about that. So first of all, if you saw during my presentation, the pharaohs really wanted to present themselves as very powerful, leaders, right? Their sculptures are huge. Everything about them is very larger than life, showing how powerful they were. So they certainly wouldn't want to have any evidence, any written or archaeological evidence of a group of slaves who left Egypt en masse, right? That was not information that they would want to have recorded anywhere. So that's one opinion as to why there's really no archaeological evidence. There are different ways to explain it. There are people who say there was a group called the Hittites, which around the time of the Exodus left Egypt, and there are some recordings of that hidden in different places. There are people who say that the Hittites are actually the Israelites. So there's that opinion. But actually, a couple of years ago, when I was in Israel, the Israel Museum did a whole exhibit on is there any archaeological evidence to the Exodus? It was a very controversial exhibit because it called into question whether the Exodus actually really happened. And it was a little bit biblical criticism and talking, delving into the idea of, did these stories really happen? So it was an interesting and controversial exhibit, but there isn't archaeological evidence for the Exodus of the Jews. Again, some people that explain maybe they were Hittites, but it does make sense to say that the pharaohs would not want that recorded. They just wouldn't want the idea that a group of slaves, picked up and left en masse from Egypt. They wouldn't want a recording. And you see how the pharaohs controlled they controlled the information, they controlled how they wanted things to be seen, how they wanted to be perceived, and how they wanted things to be remembered. So that definitely makes sense. By the way, you asked something about chariots. We do have chariots. There were King Tut's and King Tut's tomb, they found a chariot. We do have ancient Egyptian chariots, real ones, and pictures of them, but not in reference to, the chariots that were in the Yam Suf or anything like that.
I was wondering, I know that Moshe's name is Egyptian, right? Are there do we have records of any other names or any other words that came from the ancient Egyptian into the Hebrew language?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. Something to look into.
Yeah,
the answer is yes, and there's you can find articles about that. There's even a word in Bereshis which isn't translated, and Joseph has an Egyptian name, and there's a word Avruch, I think it is, which isn't translated, which appears to be Egyptian. So yeah, there are you can find scholarly articles about this.
Great.
I'm just
Something
thinking about dating things, and according to linguistic drift and looking at the words when we pick them up and how old they are in Egyptian.
So it's an interesting question. I mean, I personally do not, I can't read hieroglyphics. So everything I read is, translated by other people who do. There are people in the museum who do, and people that I work with, Egyptologists. So it is interesting. And that's it's an interesting conversation also, because hieroglyphics they're different dialects and how they're read and how they're sounded out. And it's a very interesting conversation. Any other questions or comments? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks. Also, I see lots of comments and in the chat. So thank you so much. I really appreciate all these comments and observations. And as I said, I put my email in the chat. So if anyone has any other questions or anything else that they were interested in talking about, please feel free to email me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elana.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Have a good night.
Good night.